There's something interesting about an established band who either tries to experiment with their sound due to creative frustration or because they are trying to cash in on a fad. It happens much more in rock than people realize. This video looks at 10 bands that changed styles and failed. Failure is subjective, so I'm going to explain the reasoning for each entry as I get to the band and album. This is not a top 10, no ranking, just a list. Also, I know there are way more than 10 examples, so leave a comment, let everyone know if you have a good suggestion of a band who tried to change their style and it didn't work out. Also, I will not be including Saint Anger from Metallica in this video only because I've already talked about the album at length on 2 videos on this channel. I wanted to point out other albums this time. You know how videos like these work? Let's get to it. Back in the early 2010s when the dubstep craze was everywhere and many people were trying to cash in or at least capture a bit of the popularity, one group I did not intend to go headfirst into the full electronic collaboration was Korn. With the help of Skrillex, the Path of Totality was released, and to this day it still has casual fans and diehards scratching their heads at this dated album from over 10 years ago. Looking back at that time frame and seeing what Korn was trying, I guess I just wouldn't figured Korn that would have been the band to go headfirst into a fad, as they almost always stayed in their nu metal lane. But along came Skrillex and shook everything up, I guess. I said years ago, and I stand by, that if Korn and Skrillex would have done a one-off single collaboration for Narcissistic Cannibal, the backlash would have been not nearly as drastic and most people would have praised it. Doing an entire album in this fashion I think was way too much for fans to process. Also worth pointing out the obvious here that much of the dubstep nu metal crossover has not aged well, with not too many songs being played live at Korn shows. You'll get defenders of this album for sure, but the Path of Totality stands as a weird monument to wub dub, much more than it does to heavy music. Do you want some true punk? Think Bad Religion will scratch that itch? Well, too bad, because back in 1983, only on the band's second album, Bad Religion truly went into the unknown and changed things up to more of a prog-type sound filled with piano and synth work. Not only do longtime fans discredit the album, but even members of the band would prefer it as unknown. This is one of the best examples of a fan base looking at a discography and saying, "We don't talk about that album." Even better is Mr. Brett of the band talking about how in 1983, the label sent out more copies than Bad Religion's debut because they expected better results, saying they sent out 10,000 copies and got 11,000 back. That's pretty awful. Musically, this is as far removed from punk as you can imagine, especially by the 80s standard of punk. Bad Religion only released the album once, and that was with the full box set, so they kind of had to. At least they had the band got rid of those 11,000 copies. It would have been interesting if Bad Religion would have done this a decade or two into their career, but nope, it was early on. They went back to punk in short order and left the unknown behind. It's for the best because when you have that much of a strength in writing punk, you don't need to slow it down a notch for a different genre and style. For a band who keeps reinventing themselves, the most controversial change for Bring Me the Horizon came in 2019 with Amo. After already shifting to a more mainstream feel with That's the Spirit, which was quite successful, the band went further to a highly polished digital and electronic feel, mostly foregoing the massive volume and anger the band was known for previously. Not only was the tone all over the place for Amo, but the singles were far removed from the past work, even from the more accessible That's the Spirit singles. There was definite motivation here, but I feel much of it fell flat. It wasn't a refined listening experience throughout, and such a shocking abandon of heavier elements was a lot to take in. Even now, with the many collaborative singles, including one with Ed Sheeran, has proven the band is capable of much more than Suicide Season, but the road to get there had a lot of people questioning. Amo was that big bump in the road that had people turning their heads. Keep in mind that without Amo, we would not have gotten the Survival Horror EP, which is excellent. Amo sold significantly less than the previous 2 Bring Me the Horizon releases. Is Amo awful? No, it's not. But it feels like the least cherished from the band's discography, or at least from what I've seen in both the longtime fan base and newer fans. Keep in mind, with how recent one-off singles have been coming, we may get another Amo style in the future. Mötley Crüe could do no wrong in the 80s. In the 90s, the band got desperate. Not just the band either, but also the record label, producers, existing band members, just wanting to return the Crüe to the glory days. Generation Swine was that attempt in 1997, and it was a mess from the beginning. The return of Vince Neil to Mötley Crüe was not as celebrated as Mötley Crüe would have hoped. The goal wasn't so much to release an amazing album filled with inspiration as it was to get famous again. That paired with changes in producers mid-studio session, and the replacing of a singer with Neil returning, it became too too many cooks in the kitchen and no one knowing how to make Generation Swine work. While the initial recording process with Bob Rock was going on, the band said they were ecstatic with how heavy and aggressive the album was sounding. As time went on, everyone hated it, including Vince Neil, who had to figure out how to sing someone else's written work matched to his voice for the new Mötley Crüe album. The album was a big venture away from the 80s material with tons of experimentation and alternative and even electronic elements inspired by cheap trick-of-all groups. It was executed poorly though. It would be the last album with Tommy Lee on Mötley Crüe for a while until he returned years later. Mötley Crüe became a revolving door style band, and Generation Swine was a big reason why many people wanted out. Speaking of the 80s, Muse loves the 80s. I mean, really loves the 80s. So much so that they changed their entire style to match everything going on with the nostalgic 80s Stranger Things, Back to the Future love fest going on at the time. Simulation Theory was the result of Muse trying something completely different, being sucked into the fad at the time, and making everyone go, meh. Of all the bands who I thought could have pulled something like this off, I figured it would have been Muse. On paper, it sounds right. But this album was not one long concept like other Muse albums, rather each song was made individually, and that was different for the group. This was a playlist of 80s electronic synth cheese. Not the good cheese either, I'm talking Cheese Whiz. Simulation Theory was an overproduced, overprocessed block of electronic noise with several songs sounding identical and more work being put into the retro music videos than the actual music. Simulation Theory did well in Europe thanks to pre-orders and spawned 5 attempted singles, all of which were before the album release, but in the end, Simulation Theory was in a way the perfect title, a simulation of what would happen if Muse cashed in on the electronic fad at the time. It's a far cry from Muse's great output in the 2000s, and a weird tribute to the 80s. You know what My Chemical Romance fans love? Sad, depressing, miserable emo rock with lots of expression. What happens when the tone is changed to be surprisingly uplifting and happy? You get Danger Days, the true lives of the fabulous Killjoys. Turn that emo frown upside down. Sounds about right. Yeah, a lot of fans and critics at the time were quite confused by this turn. The change in tone was obviously intentional, with MCR wanting to do something much livelier and more fun than their previous albums. So the concept this time? A group of rebels in the futuristic world of 2019 fighting an evil corporation that has its own exterminators called Draculoids. It's adorable in many ways. Danger Days was not hated by the public, but the album was not only seen as a step down from the Black Parade, but the change in tone with everyone happier and enjoying life was not what the emo fan base wanted. They wanted a sad Gerard way. That's it. He's not allowed to sing about anything else. It also includes the infamous track after the Killjoys story called Vampire Money, making fun of other bands who did the Twilight movie soundtracks. My Chemical Romance was swinging wildly, but still having fun. The band broke up a few years later. Now that My Chemical Romance is back, I wonder if we're going to get more of that broken heart style with anthems, or Danger Days 2, Return of the Draculoids. One of the big four in thrash and one of the most forgotten experiments from Slayer was in 1998 when the band tried to alter their sound for what heavy music was aiming for at the time, nu metal. Diabolus and Musica was somewhat of a knee-jerk reaction to the new style that was going on at the time, and the men in Slayer were starting to lose it in fear of how metal was turning. For all of you that love Diabolus and Musica, keep in mind that even Kerry King likes to ignore this album, referring to the album as Slayer's Turbo. When you get a Slayer album that doesn't focus on a ton of solos and thrash, it's easy to see why they don't look back at the Slayer discography and see this as a positive note. This was experimental in terms of variation, especially for a big name like Slayer, but it also didn't have the same life and aggression that Slayer was known for. So while it was experimental, it also missed the mark for the nu metal crowd and thrash fans. According to King, this was Slayer's attempt to fit into music society at that time. It's so weird to hear Slayer trying to cash in on a trend, but they learned and rebounded later. Only State of Mind would be kept as an occasional live song until retirement, which is also a testament to the album as there was much better Slayer material to be played at a live crowd. Speaking of Turbo, Judas Priest have few missteps and true outliers in the discography, but one even by the band's own admission would be 1986's Turbo. One of the biggest heavy metal names of all time decided to change things up with the times and went to glam and new wave, trading in a lot of heavy riffs and solos for synthesizers. They were hot and crazy days indeed. Rob Halford said in a 2008 interview that he had a love-hate relationship with Turbo. He's aware that it's divisive and there are songs he still thinks are great, but the over-reliance on popular technology at the time, along with moving into new territory, all led up to the album not selling as well as the group had hoped. When you think Judas Priest, you may associate it with many different songs or albums, the image of black leather or Rob Halford on a motorcycle. You would not think of it as colorful glam and new wave deep in the 80s. Or at least I wouldn't. Judas Priest corrected the ship just fine a few years later with Painkiller that blew everyone away. It was important that Halford got one more massive release before he left the group for 15 years, because it would have been terrible if his last note would have been Turbo. 50 years of Judas Priest and very few Turbo instances. Not a bad record to say the least. I, for one, am all for a band trying to evolve their sound and craft as they get older. A band like Disturbed, who became famous after a song featuring the line, "No, Mommy, Don't Do It Again," would be the perfect band to grow up a touch. Evolution was that attempt in direction, sound, and everything. It was Disturbed going alt-rock and abandoning what their fan base ate up. It was also a snooze fest. I think after the massive success of their Sound of Silence cover on a solid Disturbed album, the band decided to try their hand at more of that style and strip things down from the electronic nu metal fashion. Much less intensity and force, much more balance. To this day, I still can't believe this is a Disturbed album. The single Are You Ready led people to believe it'd be another Disturbed album that sounded standard and just like them, but wow, were they in for a surprise a few tracks in. Evolution was the first Disturbed album to not debut at #1 on the Billboard 200 since the band's first album, so it derailed the group's success streak along with few singles seeing radio play. Oddly enough, the band's attempted evolution was not an evolution at all, but rather a misstep, or at very least an odd entry. Fun fact, Evolution was a long tribute to Chester Bennington and Vinnie Paul, who the band was friends with. Nice sentiment, but you're the Owa-ah band. It's hard to take it completely serious. It was called Tee-Hee Core. Don't believe me? Singer Eddie Hermida even laughed about it, calling it Tee-Hee Core on stage in 2017 when Suicide Silence's self-titled album was released. A far cry from deathcore, this self-titled was the second album with Hermida on the mic, and the backlash was instant and furious towards the group. Things got ugly even with the group trying to laugh it off. I remember hearing Doris on Sirius XM Liquid Metal before the album came out, and the DJ and the band were together on the air defending the album, saying the band could do whatever they want, they don't owe anyone an explanation, and that the new album will blow everyone away. Then the album came out and things got worse. This was the first time Suicide Silence went for clean singing, and Hermida said he felt confident to do it. It's not so much the confidence that was lacking as it was giving deathcore fans a soft melody and Tee-Hees mixed in with the riffs. It was a mess, and longtime fans were vicious. The group would revert to traditional deathcore in 2020 and continue that route with future planned music, and for a brief period, metal got a taste of Tee-Hee Core. I'm not saying deathcore bands can't go on a different route. Whitechapel did it, and they were great. But Suicide Silence probably should have stayed silent. And that was a look at 10 albums from bands who tried to change their sound and it did not work out well. Know of another group that tried to change with mixed reactions? Leave a comment and let everyone know. Big thanks to my patrons, and special thanks to Chris Doman, Frosty Rabbit, and Dom Noble. You can have a say in upcoming videos, get weekly new music playlists, and see videos early by supporting Rocked on Patreon and becoming a YouTube channel member. Click on the join button below or click the Patreon link in the video description for more info on how you can help the channel. Please subscribe and ring the bell to get notified of upcoming videos, and you can keep up to date with Rocked on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I also want to thank everyone who kept watching this channel over the years while we've changed video types and direction. Change itself isn't bad, it's just difficult to endlessly try to figure out what people want, like many bands on this list.